Okay, welcome everyone to our Wednesday webinar. I'm very excited and very pleased to welcome Roy Childs, who's going to present to us and talk to us about psychometrics and coaching. Before we start, I would just like to tell you a little bit about Roy. The reason that I'm going to be able to do this is because I have sort of his biography here, so like in a number of other pieces of information. So Roy is a PhD in business, start again when I can actually read. Roy Childs PhD is a business psychologist who works as a facilitator, coach, trainer, and researcher. He combines a highly experiential approach with a clear practitioner focus. His background in psychometrics includes having worked with some of the best known authors of personality questionnaires, including Ray Cattell with the 16PF, 16 personality factor, and Will Schultz for FIRO. With Team Focus, his own company has developed a new range of instruments covering areas as yet untouched by psychometrics until now. Roy has worked with psychological types since the 1980s and was a founder member of the 16PF users group, now the Psychometrics Forum, as well as the Myers-Briggs user group. His combination of a psychometric background with extensive practitioner experience gave him a valuable insight into the strengths and weaknesses of both MBTI and other questionnaires, which he has used to develop a new approach to the use of type called type mapping. Roy runs the widest range of BPS, British Psychological Society, recognised qualification courses in the UK, and his publications include The Psychometric Minefield, Emotional Intelligence and Leadership, Coaching with FIRO, Element B, and The Relational Lens. And one of the things that we always like to do is find out a little bit more about our presenters that perhaps people might not know. And I can tell you that Roy's checkered career includes research, giving that up to become a lifeguard and a neurospeech on the Cornish Riviera, which he said was incredibly cold, and barreling across Europe before the UK joined the EU with van loads of English books that the East German guards were extremely suspicious of. Apparently there was a border called the Berlin Corridor in those days. He then taught psychology before establishing his own company, Team Focus. So with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Roy. If any of you have any questions that you would like to ask at any point, please put them into the chat box. And with no more than ado, Roy, it's over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. Thank you much, everyone, for joining. And in terms of, I'm sure most of you know how when you are on a call like this, sometimes you can feel the interaction and sometimes you're completely blind to it. So I'm actually looking at a screen with your videos on. It does make it nicer than looking at a blank screen or just looking at my slides, because I do like to see either smiles or frowns or whatever. But because of the difficulties of interaction, as I say, I mean, any comments in the comments box, and David might sort of stop and highlight so that we can stop for questions, but David could sort of manage that if he feels it's sort of appropriate, rather than making it just sort of me talking to you with questions at the end. I don't mind if we interrupt during that, especially if you react to anything that I say, because I am, I think, a bit of an outlier in the psychometric world, in that I am probably quite critical, of the existing orthodoxy. And that's in spite of the fact that I am a BPS verifier, which means that I verify people who are training and qualifying you to get the BPS certificate. So I know that process. I'm also a consultant editor for the test review process, which means that when people want to get the badge that their test has been properly developed, I get some people to review it, and then I collate those views, and I am responsible for the final publication of what is this test about. And I'm telling you that because I do have one foot in, if you like, the orthodox camp, but at the same time, I am fairly critical of what that orthodox camp either represents or how it is seen, viewed, and used. And I must admit that if I was in the marketplace and being or having psychometrics done unto me, I would feel quite uncomfortable. And that's because I think that there's a fair degree of misunderstanding about what these things really do. And the problem is that psychology, in its attempt to be a science, has adopted some of the trappings of science and has then, with psychometrics, overemphasized the metrics and underemphasized the psycho. I don't mean psycho, I mean the psychological elements of it. And so I feel that in a lot of ways, what we're struggling with is the tail wagging the dog, but the dog is still there, and we should learn to understand it and know it better. So I'll give you some. I wanted first of all to understand a little bit about you, because it's always interesting to know what your audience is coming for. And I recognize that having positioned it as about psychometrics and things that you could learn from it, some of you will come because you are users, you like them, and you think you might learn some more. Some of you come because you are highly cynical, which I must admit has been a position that I have taken in previous times, certainly at university when I was being lectured to by Paul Klein, the first professor of psychometrics in the country, saying, you can't do that, you can't say that. Highly cynical. But that probably most of you are somewhere in the middle. So if I sort of talk about whether you're an advocate or whether you're a cynic or whether you're somewhere in between, if you could, I mean, there is actually a little sort of button in there, isn't there, David, where people could position whether they feel they're at one side or the other. Because I'd just like to know a little bit about, you know, what's the center of gravity of the people in this course, and is it as advocates wanting to learn more, or as Bill is showing us, sort of in the middle there, probably got some cynicism, but thinking there is something in this. So is there any chance of getting a feel for you as the audience as to where you are on that?
Yeah, David, there are a number of people coming through on the chat. Explorer, advocate, explorer, advocate, advocate with care, Clive says. And Dawn has said an advocate, but with an element of explorer. So they are the ones that have come through on the chat. Advocate as well. So like from Alison, in the middle, from Melinda, advocate. I would say, so like if I'm going to add myself to that, explorer in the sense that an advocate of some, but a cynic of others. Right. A trepid explorer has come from
Colette. I position myself in that. It's a little bit of the paradox, really, that I'm an advocate and a cynic. Okay, and I think we can bridge those two things. They can coexist. And that is actually something that we need to think about in many of the things that we do. It's sort of the paradox of personality as well. We're often both ends of the scale. And, you know, this whole thing about how we average things often wipes that out. So we need to try and think about that and recognize how we can live two things at the same time. Okay, well, look, thanks for that. I mean, what I would say is that basically those who are interested or use psychometrics have a desire to add value. I mean, I presume everyone is a coach, and the motivation of a coach is to help their client in some way. And how do we do that? Well, let's explore how psychometrics can perhaps change or turbocharge how we do that. You may like to just spend a little bit of time thinking about, I'm mainly an advocate, and I think people like psychometrics because, what would you write for that? What would you write for yourself? Those of you that said you're advocates, why do you use it? What are the things? You could put some of that in the chat for later as well. But also, if you're in that camp, think about the other side. This is an old debating trick, isn't it? Take the opposite position. Try and understand what your adversary says. So why don't people like psychometrics? And those of you that are in the middle, you know, maybe you can articulate a little bit. Yeah, my hesitations are, my cynicism comes from, and whether it's theoretical, whether it's from practice that you've seen, it's worth just sorting through your own minds on this a little bit. But I'm not going to labour it because we haven't got that long. So write a few things as we go along, but I'll tell you about why I use psychometrics, or I hope by the end of this, you'll know why I do, even if at times you think, well, why would you? So, first of all then, summarising some of the things I expect you to have written is perhaps something around the way in which psychometrics oversimplifies the complexity of the human being. Okay, I mean, we got to remember that psychometrics was developed to measure cognitive abilities. It was about ability, and the whole model is based on that. And as it has moved into measuring our heart and our soul, we're using the same framework for measuring something which is quite dramatically different. So that's a theoretical way of saying, is the method and the model fit for purpose given the material that we are dealing with? And in all of that, I've always felt that people are very complex, and psychometrics inevitably, like most things that we do, just have to simplify. I mean, our whole world is a simplification. You know, we are bombarded with so much information. In the end, we take a bit, join some dots, and take a position. But we need to recognize that. And one of the things I often say to people when they're looking at a personality profile is you haven't got a reading of the person. What you've got is like, well, think of people as a book. People are full of, some books are very complex, some books are, you know, nice, linear and straightforward, but they all have chapters in them. And when we get a profile, as an analogy, and I do use analogies a lot, I would say all we are getting is the contents page. Let's remember that. You would not know a book well from the contents page, but it would give you an idea of the territory and whether you want to read it more or not. Okay, so that's an element around the reaction to people are so much more than that. Yes, it is an oversimplification, but sometimes we need to simplify. And I argue that sometimes in the chaos of people's lives, and our lives are all quite messy, that simplification can sometimes be really useful. Point one. Point two that people make about psychometrics is that, well, they're only telling you what you could have asked them anyway. And to be honest, some questionnaires, that's all they do. Some questionnaires just ask you, do you think you're persuasive? And they just ask you that 6 times. And then it comes back and says, do you think you're persuasive? Now that's not very enlightening at all. And yet that is, and there's a whole raft of questionnaires that I would say are relatively superficial and just giving you the obvious. And there's some evidence to say that. So it's like having a stop sign with a signal which is telling you this is a stop sign. We sometimes don't need that, but sometimes it is useful to let people face the obvious. And I think that, you know, we can argue that at times, having had a questionnaire that is very superficial, but just said, tell me about yourself, and you say, I could have told you that, but here it is in a profile, gives you a starting point. And then thirdly, and this is quite a strong one that people have, is that people sometimes feel constrained by the psychometric, you know, and that is because it seems to suggest this is me, okay, and it summarized me, and then there's a whole load of baggage that goes with that, which is One, that it's permanent. People, in fact, tattoo their type on their arm, like this guy did. Okay, now that might not be the spirit in which these things should be done, but it does happen. And so, and this is a very strong theme within psychometrics, which is that we have a model which is looking at people, and the model is saying we only want to look at the things that don't change. Okay, so the whole methodology is if it changes, it's rubbish, so you kick it out. I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but the whole model is about stability. And as coaches, we are dealing with dynamic individuals. And I think that that is one of the reasons why a vast body of coaches are not, not involved in psychometrics. And that's true of counselors as well, and clinicians. They see it as far too rigid. And behind all of that limiting belief is the unfortunate link to DNA. Now, you may know by now that if I tell you that this profile has been supported by some neuroscience and it triggers your amygdala and your hypothalamus is doing that, and look, it adds so much credibility. And I see now that neuroscience is being used to just sell stuff. Oh, it's committed, it's linked to the amygdala. I invite people to be highly skeptical of that, because neuroscience, hugely interesting, hugely complex, but the links and the inferences that are being made are way beyond the evidence. Extroverts have more of their frontal lobe being stimulated than introverts. Really? Where's the chicken and the egg in that? Is it that as I choose extroversion, that's what's happening? But which one causes which? We do not know. And most of that evidence is correlational. And correlational data is hugely simple to extract and hugely difficult to prove or to show the connection. You all have heard it before. Correlation is not causation, and yet causation is inferred. Oh, look, that's glowing, that's making you like that, therefore. So that's some of thy cynical beliefs. And the whole thing there, I say, is at odds with what we as coaches want to do. If you like, psychometrics is largely predicated on a model of no change, and coaches are predicated on a model of growth, development, and change. So again, there's a tension there, or there could be a tension, unless we know what we're doing with our psychometrics and using it in the appropriate way. So the fact that it's limiting. Think of how and what you do. And this is going to be a theme that will come through in more detail later on. But I had the benefit, honor, challenge of working with what are called women returners. And women returners are women who have stopped their career to raise children and then to come back into the workplace, and many then suffer crises of confidence, saying, what have I got to offer? And that was the group of women returners that I was invited to work with. And obviously we can help people to understand more about the challenge of bringing up children. I mean, I've had twins and a little girl, and 3 under 3. I mean, I know the challenge. So the thing is, though, that when we are in particular circumstances, we are limited in terms of what we can do and what we can show. And we often validate ourselves by what we do. And so confidence can be knocked. And so I talk about this as, let me do that, how sometimes we are caged by our context. context is a hugely important element in what we do, our behavior. And later on, I'm going to talk to separating the concept of behavior from personality, which has been very, very poorly addressed in many of the psychometrics that you may be using. But we are caged, and all of us, in fact, are limited in our knowledge of ourselves. I mean, many people, I ask them, they do emotional intelligence questionnaires and they think they're very self-aware. But I ask you, I've done work with the UNHCR about people who go and help people in the refugee camps and what they see and the horrors and the attacks and the illnesses. And I think to myself, how would I react if there was an earthquake and I was actually in a refugee camp? I don't know how brave I'd be. I don't know how kind I'd be. I don't know how selfish I'd be. I have a narrative about myself now, but have I really been challenged? And I'd suggest that all of us have got challenges that would stretch us. And so all of us are, to a great degree, within a cage of our existing experience. And as long as that cage doesn't change, okay, nothing needs to change. You don't need to change the narrative. But just think a bit more about the challenges that you could face if you're in Ukraine or wherever. So I want to address the question of change, because as I said, psychometrics predicated on no change and coaches predicated on the fact that, well, we do change. So to do that, I want to tell you a story which was around the values questionnaire, the VbIM, value-based indicator of motivation, which was introduced to a company. Don't know why that came up. Let me tell you before I introduce you to that, which was someone who came and did our questionnaire, the VbIM, and liked it. And a year later, she invited me in to do a session with a whole group of qualified psychometrics people. It was the HR team. They were all qualified in what was the old vernacular was level A, level B. And they all did the VbIM, and they were looking at their reports and we were discussing, etc., etc. And she said, this is so different from when I did it a year ago. And her boss, level B trained, said, well, why are we looking at this? Why should we be exploring? If it's changed, then it's not a very good questionnaire. This is based on the fact that, you know, reliability is restricted to a rather narrow concept of stability. Stability over time or consistency within things like that. It's not actually the real question. Reliability should be about accuracy. And yet we are only sold stability or consistency. So there's something wrong with that. It's worth knowing that some things are consistent, but it's not the be all and the end all. And she turned to him and said, John, I won't reveal John who, but her boss was called John. She said, John, my mother died this year, and it has really made me think about what is really important to me. And it's changed, and it is reflecting exactly what I now feel, that I am refocusing my life in a different way. No, I'm not about to leave, but I am thinking about what I do. And so you see, this idea of change being a bad thing in psychometrics is something that hangs over it quite inappropriately. We want change to be shown when there is genuine change happening. Now, that's a big question, of course. But as well then, one of my sort of issues with psychometrics is that they very often don't address the things that are important apart from the model, and values is a really good example of that. I don't know if any of you use any values questionnaires. I mean, I've used a few, and I've never found them entirely satisfactory. And the reason for that is, first of all, the coverage. You know, I used to do workshops and ask people, this is all based on the phrase I read in Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, but it's actually attributed to Nietzsche, which is a man, unfortunately a man, a person with a why will endure almost anyhow. And one of the things that so much of what is done in organizations is about behavior, but really what you want is the energy, the motivation, which comes from people's values. And if you get that right, the rest is much more likely to follow. And I don't think we do enough work. You may as coaches individually, but certainly Psychometrics has not focused well enough on what people's values are and why they do things, and aligning that with what they're currently doing. And I often see my role as a coach is to help people to develop the coachee's narrative, because we all have a narrative. And very often our narrative gets stuck in time. Oh, it's what I always say, etc. And as a coach, I see, let's update your narrative to who you are, and listen to this, where you're going. You see, so much of psychology looks at where I've come from. Oh, it's because. Knowing where you're going, and this is a fundamental difference between two of the great names in psychology. Sigmund Freud was a backward looking where I came from. Carl Jung was very much a how do I become the person that I can be? Individuation, he called it, which actually then casts people's misunderstanding around type in a, well, you know, because it gets interpreted, well, it's because of my DNA and I'm therefore here, and that can't change. Jung was so opposed to that, that his typology is grossly misrepresented in the way in which it's used. More about that later. But I said about content and the values questionnaires. When I was doing the values workshops, I would see people who would be sort of saying, what's important to you? Family. What does that mean? So many people see that. But when you explore that more deeply, you find that for some, it's about inclusion. It's about belonging. It's about being recognized and having a history. But for others, it is simply, well, not simply, but it is about the fact that I feel connected with others, that I am part of a larger community that interacts. Or for some, the family is because now I have people that I can do things with or collaborate with. My wife often says to me, Roy, life is a two-person job, you know, because she's always asking me to help her to lift this, do that, etc. So collaboration, I mean, family is such a blanket for important things. And so what we've done with VbIM is bring it into the 21st century, because I found that when people talk values, their values did not fit what the values questionnaires that I knew of and studied actually covered. And very quickly, I'll just give you the VbIM sort of model, which divides it into 4 boxes. Things, values which are about me and me now, and me and what I'm going to become. Okay, so what I want for myself and what I want to become, but also then things that are about others and what I want from others and with others, and then what I want for society. And these 4 boxes are like a sort of, I won't call it a maturity journey. Some people overlay that. But what I found in the UN, who used the VbIM a lot, was that they weren't all in box 4 down what I want the community. I thought they'd be very values driven and I'm doing it to save the world. Some of them were, and the problem for them is they didn't have enough value about what they needed now. Many of them were burnt out because they were focusing on other out there, abstract, as opposed to not looking after themselves. So this model here with all of these just basically gives you a structure for a lot of things which define values which people generally cannot articulate. You ask people, what are your values? What drive you? they struggle to do that. And they'll come out with motherhood and apple pie, integrity, honesty. You know, people will say things. Really? What I have found is useful, it takes a long time to do that as a coach, and they often still cannot articulate it. Give them a questionnaire, give them a model, they can react to it, and that stimulates a crystallization of what is really important for you. And I did, in billing this, say I wanted to introduce you to some new things in psychometrics, and that is how, just with self-report, you can actually challenge what a person has said. So what you get in the VbIM, you actually get 3 different ways of viewing the way you have answered. They're called the general, the detailed, and the comparative. I'm not going to go into the details. There's a 30-minute video if you're interested in that. I can send you details of that. But basically, where there's a difference in thy general view that, yes, integrity, but when I look at it in more detail, actually, it goes way down the scale. And compared to others, I don't value it as much as other people. You've immediately got a way to say, really? What are your values? Why? This might be more important than you realize. This might be less important than you realize. So what you end up with in the report, and this is just the 1-page summary for the administrator, is things like this one, which says influence, which when you look at it in more detail, goes to the top of the scale. This is someone who didn't realize they were power hungry. Influence, no, but really they wanted, well, in coaching terms, we often call it, I want to make a difference. And you might want to make a difference for very good reasons, but sometimes it is driven by a need to have impact. And it is, you know, so there is a power thing there. So again, this is complex. You can view the video if you want to understand that more, but this is novel. You do not get that in any other of the questionnaires, where your answers then say, do you realize what you're saying here and how it's not lining up? And you use that to stimulate discussion so that people can really challenge themselves. But you can challenge them in another way as well. And again, I don't know any of the questionnaires that do this, but this is what we call the paired process. Would you, if you did a values questionnaire, wouldn't it be useful if you had someone else say, but look, Liz, look, Dawn, you know, there's, do you think people see those values that you're espousing? You know, I think back to the MPs who were saying integrity was their sort of biggest value, and then taking money in brown paper envelopes, etc. You know, how much do you live it? How much are your values seen? So the paired process allows you to choose one person you nominate to give you some feedback on how they see you. And that in itself is a hugely useful process. And it's more than just getting the feedback. Let me go back, page up. It's more than just getting the feedback, because when I invite people to get someone to answer, say, the values questionnaire, but we apply that, if you do a personality questionnaire, how is that seen? Or if you do emotional intelligence, critical that you don't just rely on your own self-awareness, because people aren't aware of what they're not aware of. Sometimes the highest people on the emotional intelligence scales are the least self-aware of the whole group. But to have someone to say, this is what I see, that is really useful. And what you'll hear here is that I was saying, let people articulate, but then challenge them on that, because it is the challenge that is the value. It's not just answer a questionnaire, self-report. I said that. Yes, I agree with that. I mean, so often questionnaires are just used there to affirm what people already knew. Okay, challenge. How do you do that? The paired process I find hugely useful, because not only are you getting feedback from another party, which everybody actually is very interested in, but it also challenges you when you actually do the questionnaire. I'm going to ask Barry to do this on me, okay? I happen to know Barry, so I'm a bit worried about this now. But if he was my pair, when I go to do that questionnaire, I've not only said, yeah, I'm like, am I really? Actually, I don't think I do live that. Barrier probably, I've got to try and be more honest with myself. So it changes the person's engagement with the questionnaire right at the start. And I tell you what, when you have someone else doing it, your engagement does go up several notches, because you've got a curiosity there, and curiosity is fundamental to this. When people talk about test administration, it's not administration, it's engagement. How do you get people in? And that means building curiosity. I want people, when I'm saying, should we do this questionnaire, that they are saying, I really want to do that. I'm really looking forward to this. Not, all right, let's see what it gives me. Again, maybe that changes the lens and how we do some of these things. And a couple of other things. First of all, the language dilemma. There's an enormous problem that we have with questionnaires. I like change, what does that mean? And the superficial questionnaires I was mentioning earlier, they'll have, I like change, I like change on a Monday, Tuesday. They're very repetitive questions. But what does it mean? And you've got some person saying, I like change because I change my clothes every day. I like change because I want to get a new job every year. I wouldn't like to say I've been in this job for more than 6 months. And someone who says, I want to overthrow the government. We all interpret these words very differently. Okay, so when you get a score that comes out of that, what you're interested in, there's been a useful trigger, change. What you don't know is what that means, which leads to one of the other really important elements about using questionnaires, which is they are about exploration, not explanation. You're high on change. Tell me more. Not, that means you want. We don't know what they want. We need to recognize that. Words are ambiguous. They're fuzzy sets. We need to know that we're using language, and with a good set of items, we're honing it down, but we've never got it. So there's the language dilemma. There's the content dilemma. I look at some of the best known questionnaires. NEO, this is the NEO. I like being part of a crowd. I laugh easily. I believe that most people would take advantage if you let them. I would rather, these are the questions in one of the most reputed questionnaires. What are they asking? Preference, behavior, attitude, emotions. When I look in the manuals of these questionnaires, I say, where's the rationale that says what is the domain and how do I assess it? Because they're driven by the psychometric model that says, bung all these things in. If they correlate closely enough together, we've got internal consistency. That's reliable. That's good. That's not good enough. Okay. It's only one indication. When you've got the content right, you do that. And if I look at these, the first one is about preference, the second one about behavior, third one about, there's such a mix of different things that, so what am I saying? Be more critical of the things that you're using. Because it's been factor analyzed so many times, and there's all this stuff in the manual which you don't understand. Even if you've been trained, people often don't understand that. I review some of these tests and I say they've got all the things that will give them the tick boxes, but it still doesn't add up to a good questionnaire. So, third important thing is we are not just what we do. And this is the legacy of psychology with its behavioral roots, which is, in the end, well, it's behavior. That's what matters. And do these questionnaires predict behavior? Well, what is behavior? If you think about it, life is a tug of war. And at one side, you've got me and how I feel about myself. But on the other side, you've got all the demands of the world around you. That's a tug of war. And in the middle, behavior is a consequence of that dynamic. And sometimes the context rule wins out. Sometimes the inside me wins out. Okay. But if we just measured behavior, what a mess. What are we getting? And some people are dominated by their context at time. I am my job, or I am my, my family. I am. Are you? This needs to be cleaned up. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But let's be clear then that what we need to recognize is that we all play roles. The godfather was a very caring man. You may not realize that when he was shooting everyone, but in the family, if you remember Marlon Brando talking to his son, "Son, do you spend time with your family? A man who does not is not a man," etc. That was his caring side, for goodness sake. I mean, he's got a great problem answering these questionnaires, which say, on average, what are you? They're these different things. Laurence Olivier as Hamlet. Wow, what a role. But he can play a very different role, and life is a stage. We do play many roles. So one of the things that I think we need to recognize is that when, instead of asking about behavior, which is confusing, we're asking about you on the inside. This is where one of the most criticized questionnaires of all, the MBTI, actually did a really good thing. It says, no, it's not behavior. It's you, the person. What's your preference? Now, there are problems with the MBTI, but they are not the problems that are often put there by academic psychology. I regard myself as an academic psychologist, and I am appalled at the way in which the criticisms of MBTI are on the wrong wicket. Another big story there. But if you think about, what do you prefer? Would you rather eat or breathe? Well, right at the moment, I think it's breathe, okay? But I might get pretty hungry at some time. Would you rather have a week of love or excitement? Well, it does depend a bit. Would you rather have diarrhea or constipation? When on a long journey, I think it's constipation, okay? But maybe if I'm, I mean, the point is, what do you prefer is a complex question. And it has been trivialized. Oh, just think of yourself at home with your slippers on. Why on earth at home with your slippers on? That is sad. I mean, first of all, it's giving you a context. Oh, okay, well, at home, I mean, I think if it's about you, the inside, it's about when you feel most you, which isn't always at home. Sometimes it's at work. Sometimes it's striding across the moors. Sometimes it's, I mean, whatever it is. So not at home with your slippers on. And there are many sides to preference. When people answer what I prefer, sometimes what they are saying is, well, you know, I like being fairly decisive. Why? Well, you have to be in my job, don't you? It's my current role. Or sometimes it's, well, that's where I feel most comfortable. That's where I don't feel challenged. Yeah, that's okay. Or sometimes, well, it's what I prefer because that's what I always said. I mean, I was challenged on that on my 30th birthday, not that long ago, where someone said to me, Roy, you're not a student anymore. And I realized that my narrative was stuck in the past. Okay. So sometimes the change in a questionnaire isn't a change in the personality, it's a change in awareness. Am I really like that? That's what I think we ought to use questionnaires for, to help people to challenge and think, really? Where am I now? Because we are on a journey and there are more. Sometimes what I prefer is what I wish or I hope, my potential, what I could be. Sometimes what I prefer is what my mummy preferred or my daddy, you know, my history. Sometimes it's not my preference, it's what I ought to be. And sometimes it's just the fact that I'm far too serious. I'd like to be able to let my hair down every now and again, etc. So that's complex. I've simplified that difficulty by introducing what we call the four selves model. So the four selves model says, I know that you play many roles. And in fact, if you think about meeting the Godfather, I bet you'd react differently to if Barack Obama moved in, or if Trump moved into the room, or if this little girl came into the room. Each one of those would generate a different reaction. Okay. How much of that is you? How much is that the context? Difficult. But there is what I call the contextual self. And we ought to recognize that and value it, because the contextual self is also where our flexibility is. And we often want to develop our flexibility. But a personality questionnaire is not about the contextual self. That's a role questionnaire. And by the way, BEHAVIOUR is not a role questionnaire. It pretends to be, but it's not. More on that if you want later. But really, when I'm talking about preference, what I want is for you to tell me that sense of you behind the role. Lawrence, when you're Hamlet, when you're Richard III, you still know you're Lawrence. Give me the Lawrence behind the roles. And we can all do that. The sense of who I am. But then, and this is one of the critical and the biggest transformational things I've found in the conversations I've had in coaching with psychometrics, is behind the identity, there is always an ideal self. The ideal self has been so neglected. And yet you think about the poignancy of your ideal self in your psyche. What I want, but I'm not. I wish I was a little more. And I call it the four selves, because everybody who says I'm very self-aware, let's recognize there's always the undiscovered self, the self that would emerge in the refugee camp, in the earthquake, or wherever it is. Okay, that's the four selves. But what we then ought to be doing more of, and what we do with the type mapping system, is we ask people about their sense of identity and their ideal self. We call it the is and the want. The way it is, what feels natural, yeah, that's sort of me, and the want. And what happens with that is that, and this is done on a MBTI sort of language, the TDI introduces that, but it gives you then this, that this person reports as an INTJ. But they were asked, your preference the way it is, and the preference the way I want, and you can see that the want, so this is the white is the is, the yellow is the want, ISFP. This person had quite a dramatic shift from where they felt they were or felt most comfortable, but what they wanted to be. And those discussions are huge. What is that about? And we go back to what I was saying earlier. What is that want? Is it your want? Is it your parents' want? Is it what you hope? Or is it just what you thought at one stage ought to be? Whatever. And the interesting thing with this is that 72% of the population report a difference in their type when you ask the is one question, which makes a mockery of people saying I'm an INTJ, because most people have got a dialogue inside there which is saying, you know, my preference is, it depends. We have exposed people's internal dialogue, and that then becomes a curiosity. I wonder why. And one of my favorite ones was the woman who was opposite on all four things. And after 2 hours of quite expressive visual, I don't understand this, she came up with, what I want is not what I want. So it doesn't mean you want it just because you say you want it. And it was because she wanted to be successful. And her image of success was this. But when she saw that translated into personality terms, I don't want to be like that. That was transformational for her. Why aren't we doing more? I mean, obviously, those of you that know FIRO know that I got the is one from Will Schutz. It's so powerful in that model. I introduced it into the type mapping system, and it has been fantastic as a way of opening up people's internal dialogue, which is what we do as coaches. So the type mapping system, in fact, is something which covers the behavioral, the role bit, the inside the personality bit, with the aspirational personality as one, and the context. And it allows you with one model to say, this is what I do, this is what this context needs, and I ought to maybe, or we ought to be doing it more. But inside, this is what feels more natural or preferred. And that simplifies a huge complexity so that you can start the conversation, because we start from simplicity without losing the complexity. So if you want to certify in that little plug, next certification online with about 6 virtual meetings starts on the 25th of April. So why do I use psychometrics? I know we're getting close to time. Well, let me give you the story of Kevin. Kevin was a rather reluctant teenager, encouraged by his mum to come and see me because he didn't know what to do. And so basically, using psychometrics in coaching, gave him various things. And what I noticed with all of them, and is useful, is the ACDC model. Okay, in coaching, in the conversation, in the feedback, let's recognize that generally one thing that people do is they get affirmation. Do a personality, yeah, that's me. Yeah, I recognize that. Now that's very useful in the psychometrics because it buys them into it. But if that's all you do, which is unfortunately what a lot do, they go, well, is that a good session? Yes. Why? Because they agreed with it. How useful is that? Affirmation is a part of it. But what I found, and Kevin was a really good example, he was going, oh, I can see that, etc. He wasn't very communicative, but then he said, that's a good way of putting it. I hadn't thought of it like that. It wasn't a discovery. It was, yeah, I like the word. Yeah, I've got helping him to articulate himself. This is me. That is really useful. But then you get, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. They're going into discovery. Maybe I am a bit more X than Y than I thought. I have to think about that, maybe, etc. And then you get the reaction which says, that's nothing like me. No. That is where the challenge is. When people react against it, I mean, most people, very often, I've watched a lot of people giving psychometric feedback, is, oh, well, it can get it wrong, don't worry about that, it's all right, and they just deal with the other stuff. Well, look, let's just remember that basically what we've got is, I mean, the gold dust is the reaction to the questionnaire, especially the ones where they say, that's not me, okay? So isn't that interesting? The questionnaire could be rubbish, but there's an alternative here, that it's picking up on something that is just below consciousness. I mean, let's just explore that a little bit. What would it say about you? What does it mean if you were that? Is there any part of your life where it might be? I mean, a number of times that people say, well, it may have been when I was younger, but not anymore. Well, why does it come out now? The stories we tell ourselves. So I know I need to go to close. So affirmation, articulation, or communication discovery challenge, remembering that people are dynamic. And when I introduce psychometrics into a group, it goes from being a conversation between 2 people. It's like bringing a third party into the room. Well, let's see what the questionnaire says. Oh, I'm not sure about that. And sometimes if you use the paired process, it's bringing a 4th person into the room as well. So it gets us away from the me, you element, which is a useful thing in coaching, but it needs to go outside of our context. And that's part of the help in doing that. So handling disagreement, 3 useful rules. Use a good questionnaire. There are a lot of things which are like tea leaves, and tea leaves can actually challenge people too, but but you need to know it well, and you need to be prepared to let go, because sometimes the questionnaires are a bit offbeat for some people, and some people with unusual brains don't necessarily fit into the way things are done. Okay. So there's that. The gold dust is in exploration, not explanation, and I'm going to stop there because I think I need time for a few questions. Yeah, I think best to do that, David, because I'm aware of time and somehow it took longer than I thought.
Yeah, right. That was, I mean, for me, that was sort of that was like really, really interesting. Could I invite you to stop screen sharing, and then we can get to like everybody's video up. And if anybody has any questions for Roy, if you want to wave surreptitiously, or if you want me to ask, then by all means pop it in the chat. That'll be very welcome.
I noticed one there. Peter Sellers is once described as the mask. I actually got a case study called Paula Sellers, which sort of covers that. But yes, I mean, poor old Peter Sellers didn't know his identity. He used to wake up, he said, I don't know which voice to use, because he was so good at mimicking, he didn't know which was his own voice. And he was a severely depressed man for much of his life. Has anyone got a question that they'd like to?
It's more a plug from me, Roy, for you. I've been using the values questionnaire, your VbIM, and this morning I gave some feedback on career inventory, and there's been some amazing actual feedback on that, and how pleased people have been for the feedback that they've had. And also being able to challenge, like I said, being able to see the outliers in the person in the questionnaires and being able to challenge. I guess one comment that I had was I didn't know what to expect, and I've actually got an awful lot more value out of this than I first expected, which made me really think about how difficult it is to sell psychometrics in terms of proving the value. Actually, I think once they've experienced the the use of them, that's fabulous, but it's actually getting over the line and helping people to experience them.
Well, Dawn, thank you for that. And one of the things I've found is that it is coaches who get this orientation to psychometrics much more readily than the rest who are using, which is why, if you like, I feel that this is sort of my sort of favorite audience, really, because you get it in a way in which sort of many don't. But thanks for that, Dawn.
I'd just like to contribute by saying, if people who are coaches in any type of walk of life, if this is something that really interests them, there's two books that I'd like to recommend, actually. One is the Psychometrics in Coaching, which I found was absolutely brilliant when I looked at how to use psychometrics in coaching and got into it much deeper. And the other one, of course, is the Relational Lens, which again put a completely different perspective on it for me, on how to challenge and how to use psychometrics as a coach.
Well, thank you, Barry.
I had my hand up, but are we just shouting out?
Go ahead, Alison.
I was just going to say that it made me laugh because I've just come off a coaching call, and we were discussing one of the psychometrics. I think it was the learning styles one, and she said, "Oh, I don't recognise that. That's not me." So I was just thinking, oh, what did I do as a coach in that session, apart from, because obviously there's the affirmation and taking it up to the challenge point, and I had in my mind, oh, shall I leave it there? Shall I carry on? And we did explore it. And at the time I was thinking, and I said, what were you thinking about when you completed this questionnaire? Were you thinking about your work, your apprenticeship, or were you focusing on something to do with your family? And to try and take her back to the point, to see, when you're in that mindset, are you a different person? Because we change hats, don't we? If you are a parent with young children, you will be a military officer to make sure that all the operations are complete. But I think in that instance, we were trying to explore her learning and her apprenticeship journey. So it was a really interesting exploration.
Yeah. Well, Alison, if I can share with you, I got this from Will Schutz, who introduces the 1% rule, which is that if people disagree with something like this, you say, well, let's assume that there's always 1% of truth in all the feedback that you get. whether it's from people in 360 or there. So don't agree with this questionnaire. What's the 1% rule? So there's 1% that is true. So it doesn't feel like you, but where could it be true? When could it be true? Is there a small part of your life where it might be true? And that helps people to think around, and there is an element in there, because the 1% normally is more than 1%, but they need to find the little bit which says, maybe, you know, it's like so many people, you know, I used to be shy, but I've got over that now. And then, you know, it comes out and they still appear to be shy or not as confident as they thought. And it's still there. What they're doing is they're managing their shyness or their confidence. They're only putting themselves into circumstances where they don't feel too challenged, etc. So, yeah, so the 1% rule I find quite a useful one to help people.
That's handy to know. I mean, you also hear HR people talk about behaviours, and very complicated, or inference and things like that in behaviours, what one person's perception is of another and how it's received. And where I find that it's most interesting is when you come to people who are neurodiverse. They often, if you're on the Asperger's end, will be, or autistic spectrum, they'll be the most resistant to seeing some of the things that come out in psychometrics. So I don't know how you work or factor that into when you develop these questionnaires.
Well, you just have to recognize that the more people are away from the body where this was developed, and these are developed not on neurodiverse people, it's like the cultural differences as well. You know, when people are from a different culture, you know, there's more sort of slippage in the chain, and so it's more a lighter suggestion than the others. But in a way, it's the same thing, which is, I wonder how much. You see, I mean, Barry, you've heard me say this before. The two words I think people should use a lot more is I wonder, especially with psychometrics. It's not, well, this means, it's, I wonder what this means. As the facilitator, you are curious and you're wondering, you're working with them. So you don't agree with that. Well, I wonder what it could mean then. Maybe let's explore that. And that's just a bigger challenge with the neurodiverse or the culturally different. And what I've found with people from different cultures is very often, you know, they're hesitant about it because it's, you know, developed in the UK or America or whatever. But when it comes to it, it does trigger something really useful, and they actually value having done it, because it's not way off people's limit. If it was, you know, they wouldn't be able to answer it anyway. But you're just much more, especially the normative ones, you know, compared to others. Well, maybe in my culture it's different. I remember seeing the results for the 16PF with Hindi women, showed them to be the most tough-minded people on this planet. But it's because the ways in which you express tough and tender-mindedness was rather American culture, you know, visiting the ballet, etc., which they didn't do a lot of. So, you know, it just didn't work for them particularly well. And we've got to recognize that as people get more and more away from, you know, the mainstream of where it was developed, it's not that it's not usable, because actually the models are often very useful anyway. They're useful, you know, just the profile is useful. I sometimes use just blank profiles without doing the questionnaire. You know, I haven't got time for that, but just have a look. Oh, isn't that interesting? You're helping people to articulate and to structure what normally is quite a whole load of things that are in our heads, and then we just, whoops, pluck a few things out, as opposed to grouping them and saying, oh, there's a center of gravity here, I wonder.
I got into that today, actually, Roy, with the career interest inventory, where my client actually wasn't interested in a particular area, or she thought she wasn't interested, but by challenging around that, she realised that it was an unexpressed interest earlier in her life, and that if she were to change culture, that whole area would be, sorry, to change her career, that whole area would be in that area.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting, and I've had that happen twice actually, where people actually report a less interest, but actually it's because it can be an on work through interest, where they've forgotten that they were interested in it.
See, one of the things I find that we get with psychometrics is not necessarily that we uncover things that we might not, that we wouldn't have done anyway if we had long enough, but we do it quicker. You see,
Yes,
we
that's right.
can get to the core of things quicker. So I often say, think of it as a time dividend rather than anything else that you get. You get to the important stuff on the outside lane rather than the inside lane.
Right, I'm mindful of time, and for anybody who does need to go, then by all means do so. Barry has asked if you could give a snippet of information about the impact of different cultures.
I've been surprised at how much the models can be used, as long as you are using them in the way which I'm saying, which is for exploration, not explanation. So I think, there's a justifiable reaction against these things. But if you look at, the VbIM, we've got a lot of cross-cultural data in there, Barry. There's a page where you've got sort of, Chinese, Indian, etc., populations, where you can see differences in the way. And I think values is a particularly important one to bring that, that nuance in. Compared to people in your culture, it looks like this is more important to you than realize, etc. Did you have another question in there, Barry, that about culture?
No, just perhaps the maybe the difficulties in introducing psychometrics in coaching in different cultures. I was thinking mainly for myself as well in the sports world, but those difficulties that you can have.
Well, I think the difficulties can be the reputation that precedes them. So you've got a whole thing about how psychometrics are biased against ethnic minorities, okay, which largely comes from the ability testing, but it pervades the whole thing. And then there's a thing, well, I'm different, how can it apply to me? And so for me, it's always been, well, we don't have to do it, but would it be useful? Let's discuss that. And I find that most people become curious. And when they become curious and they know that we're not using it to label, we're not using it to measure, we're using it to explore and to find if there's a center of gravity that actually helps them to understand what they're saying. It's the language that we use around it. So I don't have difficulty, except when people have come with those predetermined, and justifiable at times. There's some very bad practice out there. So, you sometimes have to overcome that. But the way most coaches would approach this, I don't think there's an issue. And, it is a negotiation. I think it might be useful to do this. This is why I think, what do you think? What will we get from it? Do you want to do it? Yes, please. Let's do it then.
Okay, I've got just one final question, Roy. If you had to give one golden nugget to any coach who was thinking about using psychometrics, what would it be?
It's more than just psychometrics. It's that you have to have two things to run a good process. And those two things are respect for your client. I was particularly struck by that when I asked Steve DeShazer, who was the founder of Solution Focused Therapy, very austere looking man, incredibly powerful in the way he operated, who a lot of work was done with criminals who were referred to him by the Justice Department. So he was dealing with some of the worst, paedophiles and whatever. And I said, what do you do when you don't like your client? He closed his eyes and he said, I can't think of a client that I haven't liked. And then he qualified it. He said, because, and the whole approach of solution-focused therapy is, you find that part of them that is positive and you grow that rather than focus on all that negative and, just bring that to the fore. There's always a seed. And he said, I engage with the seed. That was, so it is that respect. And you've got respect for your client when you use those two words, I wonder, because curiosity is a really good signal of respect. So in your coaching practice, if you find that you're getting bored, you're doing the wrong stuff. You need to change it in some way. And the other, so that the respect, curiosity, all of that package. The other one is honesty. You've got to be honest. I have seen people with psychometrics, when we do the training and they get a volunteer that they've got to give feedback to, and they've got particularly high anxiety. They go, oh, you've given me the short straw, haven't you? Well, is it harder? The thing is, people sometimes want to avoid some of the information in there. You mustn't do that. It's there. You've got to find a way. There's always a way to do it and use it positively. But that is a skill and you have to learn that. But you do not avoid. You have to be honest. And sometimes you have to be honest about your own. I don't know. I'm not an expert. I love the capturing of that with, I'm the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. If we can be the guide on the side, it puts us off that pedestal where we shouldn't be. We're a guide on the side. We've got something to offer. And usually that's plenty.
That's great. Thank you very much. In which case, I'm going to stop the recording now.